Hello everybody and welcome to this session on the comprehensive analysis for the CAT 24, and this is Ramnath and we have Sunil here, and both of us will take you through each of the slots of the CAT 24, do a deep dive into each of the sections, VARC, DLR and Quant, bring you information about the pattern, the difficulty level, the cutoffs across the sections and across the slots. Alright, so without any further delay, let's jump in and look at what we have for you today. We'll start off with the overall analysis. Now, in terms of the understanding the exam, let's first look at the competition, because understanding the competition is what paints the right picture about the exam. And if you look at the competition, the trends in terms of how the competition has been changing, starting with CAT 2019 pre-COVID to what the numbers that we have now, CAT has seen a steady increase in the number of takers. Barring the two COVID years, 2020 and 21, one can clearly see that the competition has only increased. Sunil, you have anything?
Yeah, sure. Because of this increase in number, what are the implications for us apart from the ignoring the revenue increase that the IIMs may face? Firstly, if you see this steep increase in numbers over the last 2 years, it will be definitely a little more intimidating for the students to know that more than 3 lakh students are writing the CAT, and but is that really a cause for concern? Now that is what we need to look at a little more closely, because from CAT 22 to CAT 23 we saw a 30+% increase, and will this translate into really a challenge or not? It depends on the additional students who have started applying. Are they more hardworking and are they more serious students? Then maybe even the competitiveness of the exam would increase. But if it is not so, and the students that have started applying are not the serious kind, then the cutoffs may not move much. But having said that, we can say from our experience, as per our last year's CAT analysis, when this increase in test takers happened, there was a slight bump up in the cutoffs than what we expected. So it sort of indicates that the crowd that has started now to pitch in, this extra crowd of 80,000 almost students, they are hardworking and serious. So that should make the students more alert, and they should put in their best, because the exam just got a slightly more competitive.
While the exam has gotten more competitive, in a way, we can say some students have actually gotten a bit unsmart, so to say. Now, why do I say that? Despite the CAT authorities clearly specifying that the students should carry their admit card with a passport photograph pasted on it, they should not be wearing any jewelry, no belts allowed, no wallets allowed, we have seen students, in fact, a countable number I should say, unfortunately walking into the center without a photograph, wearing jewelry, carrying wallets, carrying belts, wearing belts, knowing no place to store them, because they are not obviously allowed to walk into the center wearing them. They are not allowed without a passport photograph on their admit card. Now, how can students make such silly mistakes when the authorities very clearly specify the do's and don'ts of the exam? Now, we are highlighting this point to make sure that if you are watching this video with the idea of taking the CAT exam in 2025 or beyond, make sure that you do not make such silly mistakes. Make the clear write-up is given about the authorities on the do's and don'ts. Follow it right down to the T. All right. So, moving on, we will now look at the information about the pattern. Now, as far as the exam goes, over the last 3 years, the CAT has kind of had a steady pattern overall in terms of 66 questions across 3 sections. Now, this year, there was a surprise, a minor surprise at that. If you see, the DI section had a bump up of 2 questions from 20, the number of questions went up to 22. The questions in the other sections remained the same, VARC at 24 and Quant at 22. So which means that the total went up from 66 to 68. Now, what this implies or what this means to the students is something that we'll
see here. We should probably explain about this pattern change that we saw here. And this 22 questions in DI, just two extra, right, over the last year's pattern. But that was not just as simple as that. There were 5 sets this time instead of 4. And what was the implication of these 5 sets? It's actually quite significant, and we might look at it a little more closely when we get into the sections. And it was definitely a sort of a game changer for students who have their strategy well planned out.
In addition to that, there's one, again, not as significant as the increase in number of questions, but in terms of the overall structure of the exam, in terms of how the questions were laid out to the students, there was a change in the VARC section. So far, all the RC questions, all the RC passages were given upfront, and the VA questions followed the RC questions in the last 3 cats. But now, this year, the such clear distinction was not followed.
Yes, this would have really upset the strategy of some students who are very clear that they want to attempt the RC first and then go to the VA. Now, if you keep encountering the VA after one RC and suddenly it sort of distracts you, you wonder if you should attempt it or not. So that's going to be a problem for some students. It would have been, but you should have been a little more focused and simply skip the VA if you thought it was only meant for the last.
This would also mean that those who had a rigid approach or a rigid strategy for the exam may have really faced some issues.
If you try to go only sequentially, you would have to jump from RC mode to VA mode and RC mode back, and that wouldn't have worked well.
Right.
So you should have mentally been able to skip 3 questions of VA in the middle of 2 RCs, and then another 2 questions of VA after another RC. You had to skip them. Then your flow would have been maintained and you wouldn't have lost your focus.
All right. So, one additional observation that we saw in this year's questions is that in terms of the non-MCQs, there is a change across sections. For example, if you start with VARC in the 8 verbal ability questions, but for the para summary questions, the odd one out and para formation questions were TITA, type in the answer, non-MCQs, leaving the sentence placement questions also out. Meaning putting sentence placement and para summary aside, we have odd one out and para formation questions which were TITA. Now this year, there were no para formation questions, which means the number of non-MCQs that were available reduced. What would this mean, you think, Sunil, for the students?
This would have definitely helped the students because a non-MCQ in VA is just, it makes students more nervous. So the lesser the non-MCQs, the students will be more comfortable. But of course, the negative marking of the implications that you had more non-MCQs, that way it helps because they can just guess. So you could say that the CAT examiner wisened up, because we used to have, even for 5 choices or 4 choices, there was a MCQ, non-MCQ question. So that the students were going scot-free. Now you can say that they had to take care because they would get negative marking for the MCQ questions.
Now there is a kind of a contrast seen in DALR. While the number of non-MCQs fell in VARC, the number of non-MCQs in the DALR section went up from 2 up to 10 in some slots. So if not all the slots. So which means the implications kind of would be different there in DALR.
Yes, in DI, I would say that sometimes, the questions give some clues, the choices give the students some clues, maybe potential guesses, because I know the answer may be falling in this range. So all that would not be available anymore. So it's slightly tougher. But again, let's temper it with the fact that the negative marking decreases. So that's only if you're guessing. For anybody who's trying to really solve a question, they would have preferred maybe a few choices. It would have looked more comfortable for them.
All right. So let's now get into individual sections and see how they have been in CAT 24. Let's start off with VARC. Now VARC, as we said, not much change in terms of the layout. 4 RC passages, 4 questions each, totaling up to 16 questions, and 8 verbal ability questions. Now out of 8, this year para formation questions were not there. Only these 3 question types were there. So out of 4 question types, we only saw 3. Students only saw 3 question types this year, adding up to the same 8 questions, right? Now that is one. Now, no para formation questions, while it may seem a very minor issue, something like this happened only for the first time, right?
Yes. After a long time, we have seen that para jumbles, or what you call as para formation questions, have been totally abandoned, and instead the questions that looked like para jumbles were simply the odd one outs, and there is a very good likelihood that some students might have assumed them to be para jumbles or para formations, and they would have just gone ahead and entered a 5-digit number there, and that was completely they would have lost their marks there. But it's interesting to know that they have completely done away with para-jumbles.
And coming back to RCs, now how have the RCs been across these slots? Now we know, based on the inputs from the students, that the RC lengths have been kind of comparable with those of the earlier last 3 years, so to say, around 450 to 500 words. And also when we pit Cat 24 against Cat 23, let's say, the passages have been more readable.
Yes, yes, the passages were definitely more readable, but there were a couple of passages in every slot which had the reading needed a lot of critical inferences or critical reasoning kind of an approach. So the readability or the density of the passage to read it wouldn't have been challenging, but to understand it, to comprehend it, some couple of passages in each slot were definitely needing the student to think more. So that would have shown up in the difficulty level of the passages. But readability wise, you're right. There was much more readable over last year compared to last year.
And again, while the readability has kind of increased, the questions in a way kind of got trickier. Now why? Because there were questions with double negatives. In fact, a couple of
even triple negatives. It was like a question which says, which of the following, if false, will not be inconsistent with? Now, can you imagine, wrap your head around that in the exam? Students should have been really careful going around it. They should have reduced that triple negative quickly to a single negative, because triple negative means a single negative, and they should have been able to tackle it, but it could have cost them a lot of time, because you see that for few seconds, few minutes, you might solve it a different way. And you suddenly realize that it is a triple negative, and then you go through the choices again. That kind of time waste would have happened.
Chances of you getting it wrong and also spending a lot of time, both
reworking it, trying to understand it right way. So it would have really troubled. But this is a trend Cat has been doing from the last 3-4 years, and they have only doubled down on it this year, I can say. Yeah.
And while there are all these double, triple negatives, there are also the options have been a lot closer than what we have been seeing in the recent Cats. Or you say it's more in line with the recent Cats. What is your opinion on how close the options?
The options have been getting closer over the last 2-3 years, but this year we would say that it is a little more difficult, because the choices were sort of two choices at least would have made you waste a lot of time. So this was a little more than last year, I would say, and these are the places where the students should have been very, very ruthless in their and very disciplined, and they shouldn't have wasted time, because that would have brought down their attempts a lot. These close choices, you should either go with your comprehension and gut at that moment, and no amount of extra thinking would have probably helped you be more right than otherwise.
I think one factor which is which could go in favor of the students is that the areas from which the passages were chosen were not really areas like deep philosophy or psychology or like anything like that. Areas looked, or maybe this actually could go in favor or actually go against them, because the area might look familiar, but the passage could be dense.
Yes.
That could be...
The areas were definitely not complicated, like not philosophy or not some hyper or modern feminism. These kind of deep topics were not there. But as I said, there were a couple of passages where the topic was intricate, and you had to read between the lines, and at least a couple of passages where it was easygoing, smooth reading. But the challenge always again came back to the questions, the nature of the questions, the way they were worded, with those double negatives and all the critical reasoning kind of questions, plus the options being close. So this is definitely something which would have been which student needed to be very careful while navigating these questions.
Let's look at the verbal ability question. Let's start off with the one at the bottom, the odd one out questions. The difficulty level, students have reported that odd one out questions were tricky. Again, is this different from what we have seen in the earlier Cats? Maybe not. But this year, I think the reports have been
slightly different nature this time. The students have said that it was almost impossible to form a coherent paragraph of the 4 sentences, and the 5th sentence looked so similar, there were no connectives. So the difficulty level of these odd one outs really increased this time. So students couldn't try to form a coherent passage and then see which doesn't fit. They should have instead simply looked at which 4 of these 5 sentences form a group. You know the terminology that is mentioned, the topics that are mentioned, the words that are mentioned. You just sort of try and identify the one which stands out. And that would have been the best and the quickest approach to deal with them, but they were tough. And the toughest of the VA questions were these 2 odd one out questions. We can confidently say that.
While that is how odd man out was, para summaries on the other hand threw a different kind of surprise. These summaries were pretty crisp and short, which means that student had to distill the entire passage that was given into a pretty short.
Yes, there if you read the directions correctly, they keep emphasizing that which of the choices captures the essence. And the essence is a highly condensed form of the content. And so we see that the length of the passages this time has increased. So they had to read more. So I would probably say around 4-5 lines of paragraphs went to 6-7-8 lines of passages this time. And they had to be condensed into something like, students said that there were passages which are less than a line, less than one line. So how do you condense 8 lines into less than one line? You need to understand a better grasp, get a better grasp of the author's point of view and where the para is driving at. So that way it was challenging, and the choices were also close. At least a couple of choices were closed during in these para summaries. But someone who understood that they had to look at the essence, they would have definitely cracked them. They wouldn't have felt it too difficult. Anybody ignoring the fact that they have to look out for the essence, they could have got lost in at least a couple of choices in these questions.
While these two kind of tested the students in a way to the extreme, sentence placement questions on the other hand were kind of lifesavers. Relatively compared to the other verbal ability question types, the 3 sentence placement questions across all slots. The feedback is that across all slots, sentence placement questions were
definitely they were a lot more doable. They would stand out. The answers were standing out. You know, this sentence cannot fit in the other places. So that way, it was probably a breather from these 5 tough questions. These 3 questions would have encouraged students a little bit, and probably these sentence placements would have taken a lot less time also. So hopefully all 3 sentence placement questions were covered by students who didn't complete the VA part. They could have at least made sure that the sentence placement were covered.
So one last point before we move away from the VRC and look at DALR, the placement of verbal ability questions in between RC passages. That also would mean a key strategy point which students need to keep in mind. When only 2-3 minutes of time is left at the end, starting with an RC passage at that time obviously doesn't make any sense, because you would not be able to get anything in that time available. But if it's a VA question instead, you could definitely, it's most likely that you will be able to answer that question in 2 to 3 minutes. So earlier, when RC passages were together and VA was at the end, it was kind of, in a way, the layout was helping the student.
It was a default approach. It was kind of a default approach, and it was probably a good strategy. I mean, we shouldn't rule out somebody who's more comfortable. See, sometimes someone may want to take a break from RC and do a couple of VA questions, but that would be rare, and it's definitely more taxing than just doing RC continuously and then quickly running through the VA questions, because frankly, some VA questions can be solved in like less than a minute. And some VA questions, if you get stuck, you may spend 2-3 minutes. So VA is more flexible in that sense towards the end, and RCs you can do, but some people do only 3 RCs, so they can spend more time on VA. And then you can go to the 4th RC. So the strategy that you built over over the many aimcats that you've taken, all the mock exams you've taken, that should have been tested a lot in this CAT across all 3 slots. And I should say one more thing, I mean, we can venture to say is that CAT examiner sort of has maintained this characteristics that we have just explained across the slots. So what we are giving you is a overall comprehensive analysis of, let's say, the VA section, and what we have mentioned about the odd one out being tough and the sentence placement being easy. This is true across slots. Now that's commendable, because they seem to be very careful with the kind of questions and the difficulty levels they have chosen. And maybe we can even say that across slots they have tried their best to keep this uniformity of pattern and difficulty levels and nature of questions. Yeah. It's a good thing, and it's a good positive development.
So let's now move on to the DALR section. Look at what happened in DALR. Now, as we already discussed earlier, the big change in terms of the number of questions happened in this section. Earlier, when there were 20 questions, we had 4 sets of 5 questions each. Now, this year, the distribution changed to 2 sets of 5 questions each and 3 sets of 4 questions each, adding up to 22. Now, what does this mean to the students? You kind of started off explaining
Yes.
this earlier.
Yeah, we said we'll come back to this. This is the significant change in the pattern. After 3 years of having 4 sets in the DI section, we now have 5 sets. And also, there are 2 more questions. Well, that may be a small change, but the choice of sets, when you have 5 sets, you can choose more, and you can choose more with better resolution, I would say. You're not constrained. If there were only 4 sets, a student had to, he knew he had to attempt at least 3 of them, and maybe someone who's very good has to look at the 4th one also. So it used to be very tough for them because they can leave out nothing.
Right.
But when there are 5 sets, it sort of goes without saying that one set I can identify and leave it aside. So if someone spends a little time, so in the beginning, that's what these 5 sets mean, the choice that you get. The implication of this is that you need to invest a couple of minutes at the beginning.
So having the choice is one thing, utilizing the choice the
Yes.
right way is another.
Here again, students should remember, they should not scroll through every question saying next, next, next. No, they should go to the question paper view, and they should be able to scroll quickly through everything. Of course, they shouldn't just glance. They should read a little, maybe half a minute per set. And in the process, you get an understanding of the topic and the length of the question and the number of variables. So you can just quickly grasp what is there. So in this 2 minutes or maybe 2.5 minutes, you should be able to identify the one set which you probably don't want to do, or the 2 sets which you will leave for the last, and all of the 3 that are remaining you would have decided to attempt, and of them you pick one which to start with. So that would have been an excellent strategy. So the easiest you are going to start with, and the tough 1 or 2, you know, you're going to relegate them to the last.
One good thing that CAT did for the students, in terms of from the students' perspective, so to say, not only did the choice increase, but also the number of doable passages that went up.
Yeah, the sets.
Compared to last year.
Yes.
Last year there was almost no, in some slots.
Yes.
There was close to 0 definitely doable sets. But this year, I think
students had no option last year but to sit with the tough set, spend 15-20 minutes and struggle, maybe crack one, and then the second one they are somewhere in the middle and the time runs out.
Yeah.
This time, 2 sets, or at least 2 sets in every slot were doable, and a student who planned well and chose well, we can assure that even a medium or medium level student would have attempted at least 2 sets. And the doability of these sets also was much more. They were easier, and they were obvious. I would say there was a clear distinction between DI and LR this time. And because of the clear distinction between DI and LR, the students would have been more comfortable selecting their sets.
So if I'm comfortable with LR, I'm sure that whatever set look like LR, I'll start with that, or at least try and start with that. And this kind of distinction was missing particularly last year.
That made it more difficult for students to select the sets, because everybody has a strength. I mean, unless you are exceptionally good, everybody prefers DI or let's say LR, and you would go to your comfort area. So last year and the year before that, students had a problem because it's not possible. It was not possible to separate these sets and say this is LR, this is DI. And the difficulty level was so high. Now it is uniform across 3 slots that there were 2 LR sets and there were 3 DI sets.
2 reasoning based DI.
Yeah, and then there were 2 reasoning based DI.
And 1 calculation.
Every slot had 1 calculation based DI, and that is something which probably was something should have been attempted by everybody. And 1 more DI set out of the 2 reasoning based sets probably was doable, and maybe 1 out of the 2 LR would have also been doable.
Should be the 3rd set. If one
this pattern was sort of this is true probably of all the slots, as far as we have analyzed, and that again, as I said, the IIMs are doing a good job of maintaining this pattern, consistency, difficulty level, distribution throughout.
So let's move on to the Quant area, the Quant section, and see what happened in Quant this year. Now, overall, in terms of distribution, again, we don't need to discuss the questions much. Overall, 22 questions across all the last 3 CATs and this year too. So we'll only discuss the distribution across the major areas. The good change that students have seen this year is that the number of arithmetic questions went up from last year. The algebra, you could switch the places of algebra and arithmetic almost. The algebra was very heavy, and it was a little difficult for students to get into those questions. This would have been a very relief for them to look at these questions, short questions, simple arithmetic questions. A good number which would have encouraged the students, but if they had selected them, if they had not wasted the time on other questions. No, that selection of questions plays a role everywhere, in every section, more so in quant, particularly because
there's a lot of choice. There's a lot of choice. You could end up wasting time on those 2-3 questions which would actually have been completely left out. Because there are 22 questions for you, there are 22 chances to make a mistake of spending time on the wrong question. And that is why that would have been more challenging. But the good thing about this CAT and this quant section here across slots is that identifying the easy questions was pretty straightforward. You could have selected maybe 7-8 questions and focused on them, and then gone on to the strategy that we always explain to you during our aimcat strategy sessions. That would have worked perfectly well in a paper like this.
So coming to further distribution in terms of specific topics that generally make or not make an appearance, the topics like, let's say, trigonometry or probability or Venn diagram, which have kind of been absent over the last few CATs, did not make an appearance this year too. So that was kind of in a way relief to many students. And in terms of the overall, as Sunil was trying to say earlier, in terms of difficulty level, comparing the difficulty level of last year's CAT with this year's CAT, clearly this year's CAT, because of the number of questions from arithmetic, number of identifiably easier or moderate questions, one can clearly say that the difficulty level this year is a notch.
The difference was completely palpable. You come out of the center, students said that everybody's faces were, lit up or normal, compared to last year when everybody's faces after the quant section was completely sad faces and downcast faces. So the quant was a slight, it lifted up the spirits of students in that sense that while the cutoffs may not increase significantly, because ultimately it is very competitive and the time is limited. So we are expecting the cutoffs maybe to increase by a couple of questions more this year, or 1 to 2 questions more than last year. Yeah. So 5-6 marks. So we'll look at the cutoffs in a while. Yeah.
Now we look at the cutoffs slot wise at multiple percentile levels. So we'll first look at the sectional cutoffs. Now sectional cutoffs for VARC in the 85 percentile in the morning slot.
So this is a good comparative way to look at how the difficulty levels were sort of close or far from across slots.
The slots. Now as you can see, while there is a minor difference, overall, as we were discussing earlier, CAT did a fairly good job keeping the difficulty level and pattern distribution, etc. very tight and close. So while one may say that, hey, there is a 1 question difference, that is not much in the overall scheme of things, so to say. So 21 questions or 22, 23.
And remember, these are our estimates with plus or minus 1 mark. That's we give you a perfect estimate, but this is, you can take it with a plus or minus 1 mark as a possibility.
Yeah. So that is, now before we go there, so what would this mean effectively? Now 21 to 23 would mean 8 questions or 9 questions attempted and getting 1 or 2 wrong.
1 or 2 wrong,
broadly end up in this area. So 8-9 out of 24.
With
so
good accuracy.
Basically 1/3 of the paper. See, many people think that, hey, CAT has 66 questions or 68 questions to be solved in 120 minutes. Less than 2 minutes per question is what I have. But if you look at this, to clear the cutoff, you need to solve 1/3 of the paper. So 1/3 of the paper would mean that you have about 6 minutes per question, so to say. Right? So that is how you need to look at it. It's not that you need to answer each and every question in the paper. What is it that you need to get to? That's what you need to look at. So let's now look at DLR. Again, the range is fairly close, Sunil?
Yes, that's very tight. I mean, couple of questions, couple of marks is absolutely nothing here. So here we see that the evening slot seem to have one pretty easily identifiable and doable set. And that's why the 2 marks we are showing, our estimates show that at least 2 marks may be higher. The cutoff may be higher here, the 85 percentile mark. There was a easy and doable question across slots, but in the 3rd slot, students have said that it was much more obvious, and the effect of that
and doable at the same time.
Doable, a little more doable.
Yeah. So in quant, again, the range is fairly close, and again, as I was saying earlier, the range is 14 to 17. Now 17 would mean less than 7 questions to be attempted with 1 question wrong, so to say broadly.
Yeah,
right?
probably, yes.
So 7 to 8.
In quant, we could say, yeah, 2nd slot was probably the tougher of the lot. It's distinctly, at least 1 question wise, it is tougher. But yeah, that you would probably say that quant is having the biggest variation of 3 marks there, and same as verbal. Yeah, 2 marks overall, here, 2 marks
fairly
here.
Fairly balanced paper, right? Definitely easier than last year. One can, I think, definitely say that about CAT 24. So let's look at the overall cutoffs now. If you look at the overall, we have given these cutoffs at 3 percentile levels, 90, 95 and 99. That is because in general, students from the general category all can expect an IIM call from upwards of 90. So we have started off at that level. So if you see the variation across slots, so the minimum we see here is 53 and the maximum we see here is 63. So across all the entire paper, 10 questions, meaning 1 question per slot is what the variation is. So again, what we said earlier, in
this builds up across the sections. So if every section had a 1 question up or down, it's possible that 2 sections have skewed it away. So 2 marks, 2 questions away it could be maximum. So we are looking at about 2 to 3 questions of difference here.
Yeah. So those aiming for a 99 plus percentile, this is what you need to broadly the kind of the maximum
99.
Score. 99 is what could get you a 99 percentile upwards. If
in third slot, in the evening slot, and comparatively little less in the second slot. Here the overall is about 87 to 90. So in terms of overall, the second slot seem to have been little tougher.
Yep.
Yes.
So anything else you want to add or? All right then. So that's all we have for you folks in this session. So thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.